of Hyperdrive Agile. And thank you, Steve, for the kind introduction. Steve is a phenomenal Agilist, and I love having him be part of the hosting team for this program. Today, I'm really psyched. We've got Bjarte Bogsnes here, and he hails from Norway. If you don't know Bjarte, I don't know where have you been, but Bjarte's been a growing wave. He's been leading a growing wave of Agilists who have been thinking about business agility. More importantly, he's been one of those icons who've talked about business agility years before anyone else, and took the time to adopt agility by not taking on Agile per se directly, but rather by thinking through how to change the mindset. And he's been successful at leading the effort at a company known as Equinor, formerly known as Statoil. So if you imagine an oil company using some sort of Agile practices or having an Agile mindset, might be unique and different, but Bjarte was at the tip of the arrow for this and helped shift the culture beyond anybody's expectations. Bjarte has also written a couple of books. His most recent just came out a week ago, 2 weeks ago. I got my copy. Implementing beyond budgeting has been something that people have talked about, and beyond budgeting certainly has been a topic for a number of years, but implementing beyond budgeting. But as far as the first and second books that Bjarte has written, have you written more than two?
3 actually.
3. There you go. So I'm a book behind already.
Don't worry.
Well, first, thank you for joining us, Bjarte. Really enjoy having you here, and glad you're able to make it and to join our meetup group. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Bjarte, and you got the lead on this.
Thank you, Stacey, and thank you very much for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this, and I think I'll start with sharing my slides right away. So you can see those, I hope. My first slide, okay? Excellent. So I often quote the author Douglas Adams, because he once said that I might not have gone where I intended to go, but I think I ended up where I needed to be. And I'm saying this because this is the story of my life, and because it was in no way given that I should be here today with you and talk about beyond budgeting, because my career started in a very different place. I joined Statoil, Equinor, at early age, graduating from business school, and my first management job the year after was head of the corporate budget department. So I've been heading up more budget processes in my life, in that job and in many other finance manager jobs in different places in Europe. So I know what I'm talking about. But I'm also one of the few finance people that have worked in human resources. I've been heading up a human resource function for 5 years, which is actually highly relevant for beyond budgeting, as you will understand when we are finished. What I want to share with you today is first the case for change. What is the problem? And you know, we might look at problems with traditional management from a slightly different angle than what you guys are doing, but I think you will recognize very much what I'm talking about. And these problems are much deeper, more systemic and more serious than what we often think. So that's where we need to start. Then I'm going to talk about beyond budgeting as a solution to many of these problems, most of them, maybe all of them actually. And by all means, beyond budgeting is a somewhat misleading name. This is about business agility. And I'm a big fan of Agile, but Agile was not designed originally as a way to run an organization, an enterprise, right? So when you're trying to scale Agile, the holes in Agile become visible. And these are the holes that beyond budgeting are filling, because beyond budgeting was born from day one as a business agility model 25 years ago, that that label business agility didn't exist back then. So every time I say beyond budgeting, think about this as business agility. So I want to share with you the model itself, then some exciting, well, at least one exciting case. We don't have that much time. We'll see how much time we got here, but I want to finish off with, well, how can you get started on this journey? So that's basically the outline for the next hour. Every time I talk about beyond budgeting, there is one word that keeps coming up over and over again, and that word is control. And you understand the context and why. It is about the fear of losing control. I often ask people, what do you mean with control, and what are you so afraid of losing? And after people have said cost control, many go quiet. They actually struggle with defining what they are so afraid of losing, which is quite interesting. So I checked up in Oxford Dictionary, how do they define control? And they call it the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. And what does this mean in organizational terms, in business terms? Well, it basically means controlling people and controlling the future. And behind these two lies the two main assumptions behind traditional management, as we see it. Number one, you can't trust people. Number two, the future is predictable and plannable. And as you know, this is not true. So this is what we are challenging in Beyond Budgeting, because these are illusions of control. Of course, you can manage people, but if people are managed in stupid ways, hopefully they find a way around in order to get their job done. And when it comes to the future, the only thing we know is that we don't know. When it comes to people, trusting people, like many of you, I have always traveled a lot. And the first thing I always check when I enter a hotel room is what kind of clothing hangers do they have? And these are the two types that you typically meet. And I guess we can all agree that the one at the bottom is a hassle to use compared to the one with a hook. So how some hotels offer us these stupid hangers? And we all know why, right? It is about a few stolen hangers with a hook. And what was the response? To punish everybody because somebody did something wrong. Actually, one of the problems with traditional management, which I will come back to. Wise people have definitely agreed with what I've just have said, both about people and planning the future. Good old Peter Drucker, most of what we call management is about making it difficult for people to do their job. Sometimes that is the problem. We manage too much. And when it comes to planning the future, another wise person, Russell Aikoff, he compared a lot of the corporate planning he was observing in big organizations. He compared it with a ritual rain dance. It has no effect on the weather, but those who engage in it think it does. And again, I can relate to this because I have done a lot of dancing in my life through all the budgeting process I've been heading up. The dancing was great. I'm not sure it really had a big impact on the performance of the organization. Okay, so much for wise people. Imagine an organization that 100 years ago invented a fantastic machine. It was state-of-the-art and crucial for the success of this organization. 50 years ago, this machine started to make some trouble, and today this machine is completely broken. It looked like this. This is not a true story, because in real life, hopefully people would have done something 50 years ago, right? Either try to fix the machine, or even better, try to invent a new one, new, different, and better. Because innovation is something we all love, right? Innovation is great, wonderful. We all want to be leading edge, unique, right there in the forefront, better than everybody else. But that enthusiasm for innovation seems to be limited to technology innovation, into product, services, and so on. But there is also something called management innovation that we should talk about today, right? Exploring new ways of leading and managing. And management innovation, that isn't great. That is scary. Kicking out the budget, are you crazy? Losing control, are you crazy? The consequence of this is that it's very crowded on the left-hand side. Everybody is into that kind of innovation in some form or shape. Management innovation is not yet a crowded place. because it's scary, right? But this is actually good news for brave organizations, brave companies who dare to explore, to embrace also this kind of innovation, because you can get just as much performance, competitive advantage out of management innovation as you can get from technology innovation. And there are companies out there in our communities who openly say that we have no advantage whatsoever in what we produce, what we sell, what we provide. We find it in the way we lead and manage. So it's all about performance defined in the right way. So I will come back to that important word. That is why you should go beyond budgeting, because it is good for performance defined the right way. So I will come back to that word, but before that, it is still called beyond budgeting. It has something to do with budgets. It has something to do with budget problems. So before we move on, I want to share with you my budget problem list. And then I wanted to reflect on, are there any of these problems you haven't experienced in the organizations that you have worked for? After that, I'm going to start to continue to be a little bit more philosophical before I will make this much more concrete towards the end. What does this mean in practice? But bear with me, I'll start off a little bit philosophical. My budget problem list is quite long. This is what many people think is the biggest problem, very time consuming, making budgets, following up budgets. I disagree. The problem does belong on the list, but there are much bigger problems here. Assumptions quickly outdated. Sitting last fall and making a budget for 2023, it must have been like looking into a black hole. I just don't understand how it's possible. And all those assumptions are probably outdated already. This is a serious problem. Budgeting can stimulate what I would call unethical behaviors. The lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, the resource hoarding, the frenzy December spending. These are not the kind of behaviors we would like to see in our organizations. At the same time, I'm not necessarily blaming anyone for behaving like this, because people are just responding to the system we have designed for them to operate in. So if we want to change behaviors, it's not about fixing people, it's about fixing systems, which again will change behavior. And you know this stuff. Budgets can create these illusions of control. Of course, it might feel very comfortable to have next year described with a million details and decimals. But again, the only thing we know is that we don't know, and that this will be wrong. And if we don't have control, whatever this word might mean, then maybe it's better to acknowledge, accept that we don't have control and act accordingly, than to think that we have it, fool ourselves and act accordingly. It can be a bit painful, but that is the way it has to be. Budgets force us to make decisions too early. We have to decide in the autumn, the year before, what we should do next year and what it shall cost. And in large organizations, too many of these decisions are taken too high up. That doesn't always improve the quality of decisions, as you know. Sometimes it's actually the very opposite. Budgets can prevent us from doing stuff we should have done, but we can't because it's not in the budget. But this also works the other way around. Sometimes it might maybe lead us to do things that we shouldn't have done, but it is in the budget and it is spend it or lose it. You know the game. And linked to this, I fully accept that the cost budget can be a very effective way of managing cost as a ceiling for cost. It works. But let's not forget that that's just half the story. That ceiling is just as effective as a floor in the sense that these budgets tend to be spent for the reasons we just discussed. And to define good performance as hitting the budget numbers is a very narrow, a very mechanical, and very often quite an outdated way of describing what is good performance. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent performance language. Now, how many of these problems have you not experienced in your own organization? I can't see you all, but I think there is a lot of nodding heads and guilty smiles. And if so, you are in good company, because I've been sharing this list of problems with hundreds of thousands of people around the world in the almost 30 years I've been working with Beyond Budgeting now, before Beyond Budgeting was born, actually. And most people out there agree, executives, managers, finance people, Most of them agree. At the same time, most organizations continue doing this stuff, even if that is changing these days. That's quite interesting, and I have a theory about why. But before I share that, I'd like to add on one more problem that not too many of you have on your list, and I've called it conflicting purposes. It's a very interesting problem because it's both a problem, but it also represents a solution to many of these other problems. So I will come back to that one a bit later. But how come so many continue with what they admit is a bit stupid? Well, one reason could be that the problems are acknowledged, but they are regarded more as irritating itches than symptoms of a bigger, deeper, and more systemic problem. But that is exactly what these problems are, symptoms of a very serious problem, which is also a paradox. Because here we are looking at a 100-year-old management technology. It's very old management technology. And in case you didn't know, the inventor was Mr. James O. McKinsey, the founder of McKinsey Consulting. He wrote a book back in 100 years ago called Budgetary Control. I never met Mr. McKinsey, but I don't think he was an evil man. I actually think Mr. McKinsey had the best of intentions. He wanted to help organizations perform better. And I'm sure it did 100 years ago. This was management innovation 100 years ago. And maybe it worked even 50 years ago, but no longer today, because things have changed. Today, this way of thinking, this way of leading, this way of managing is doing exactly the opposite. It has become more of a barrier than a support for getting out the best possible performance. And that, my friends, I would call a pretty big problem. So we are back to this important word, performance. Again, that's why we should go beyond budgeting. And I would like to reflect on that word now for a few minutes in a very different setting than business and organizations. I would like us to move into a different setting where we also would like to experience good performance, namely in traffic, when we are out driving, right? And for me, that would mean a safe and good flow. I simply hate traffic jams. And by the way, I've never understood why it's called the rush hour. There is no rush at all. Those cars are standing dead still. But there is so much I don't understand. Anyway, I think traffic authorities want the same. And this is something we often meet, put up by traffic authorities, whether it's crossing traffic. This light has no sensors, okay? So 2 questions here. Who makes decisions about when you have to stop and when you have to drive? Well, that's the guy who programmed this light. It's the programmer. That's the manager here. And where would that person be as you sit there waiting? Well, somewhere else. I never checked, but I don't think there's anybody sitting inside that pole, right? See my slides disappear there. So, and which information would this programming be based on, right? It would be based on some historical trends, maybe some forecasts, but this would not be entirely fresh information as you sit there waiting. But again, the best of intentions, trying to create a safe and good flow. Fortunately, there is an alternative, a very different solution with exactly the same purpose. We are talking about the roundabout. Here, the answers to the same questions are very different, because here we are in control as drivers. We make decisions about when to stop and when to drive. And the information we use to take these decisions is fresh, real-time information. So very different answers. Could be interesting to compare these 2 ways of managing. So let's do that. And here I've got a few leading questions for you. It's actually proven scientifically that the roundabout is not just more efficient, it's actually also safer, and lifetime cycle cost is lower. But we also know that the roundabout takes more competence from all of us. It is more difficult to drive in. And going back to our organizations for a minute, everything we need to leave behind of traditional management is, for everybody involved, actually much easier than what we need to move towards, which we will talk about afterwards. That includes budgeting. It's very easy for managers. They know exactly what they are supposed to deliver at. They know exactly how much you can spend. It's a very easy life. For finance people, It's easy as well. The job is done when they have explained budget variances. So what we need to move towards, it takes more competence from all of us, but it also makes work so much more rewarding, so much more meaningful, so much more value adding. But it isn't necessarily easier. If there is a mindset about me first, I don't care about the rest, that mindset is normally not a big problem in front of that light, hopefully overruled by red. But in the roundabout, me first, don't care about the rest, can actually be a big problem, because here we are much more dependent on everybody involved sharing a positive common wish or purpose of wanting this to flow well, right? Here we have to help each other. We have to interact with people in a very different way than what we need to do as we sit there dosing and waiting for the green light. So it's not enough with fresh information and the authority to act on it. You also need positive values and attitudes. Two other important and relevant words here. Trust is obviously one. In front of that light, we are not trusted to make decisions. In the roundabout, we are. And whom we need to trust also differs. In front of that light, we need to trust the programmer and the hardware, the light itself. In the roundabout, we need to trust other people. The other important word here is transparency. Not important in front of that light. As long as you can see the color of that light, you can make your decision. But in the roundabout, you need to see and understand the entire situation in order to make a wise decision, right? I'm quite sensitive to language, words, labels that we use in the important stuff we are discussing here today. And maybe I'm oversensitive, but there are some of these labels I actively dislike. And one of these labels is performance management. I dislike that label, performance management, for two reasons. First of all, I find it quite negative. Because aren't we saying, consciously or unconsciously, that if we don't manage your performance, there will be no performance, right? And secondly, I think there are quite some illusions of control playing out here. I think our ability to manage performance in today's business and people realities is actually quite limited compared to what many executives and managers, finance people, and HR people would like to believe. But performance management as a label fits very nicely when we talk about traffic lights, because that's exactly what traffic authorities are doing. They are managing performance very directly. In the roundabout, it's about something else. Here, it is about creating conditions for great performance to take place. It is about enabling performance, not managing performance. And this is about much more than playing with words. These are two fundamentally different ways of addressing that important question of how do we get the best possible performance in our organizations. That question is not new. That has been with us always. It is the answers that have changed. We're going to leave traffic. The roundabout is a more self-regulating way of managing. And self-regulation is another important word, because today organizations need more self-regulating management models for at least two reasons. The first reason is about our business environment, with a lot more of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity out there, all the VUCA, much more of it today than when I started my budget and planning career in the early 80s. And if we take that VUCA level seriously, it must have implications for how we design our management models compared to if there's little or no VUCA out there. That should be quite obvious. The other reality we need to reflect on is internal. It has to do with people, employees, asking ourselves, what kind of employees do we generally believe that we have in the organization? And I'm sure you are familiar with Douglas McGregor and his theory X and theory Y, which is spot on here, right? Theory X and this negative view on people, that most people is a bunch of potential thieves and crooks, and unless we manage them tightly and keep them on short leashes, they will all run away and do a lot of stupid things and spend money like drunken sailors. Well, if you read McGregor, you will know he was a bit more polite than academic, but I think that's what he meant. Then you have theory Y, this much more positive view on people, this view that most people actually want to perform, they want to be involved, they want to be listened to, they want to be treated as adults. And we don't need to agree so far on where our sympathy lies, X or Y, even if I have a certain hope. but it should be very easy to agree that if we mainly believe in theory X, our management model should look very different compared to if we mainly believe in theory Y. If we combine these two, it could look like this, and traditional management lies in this lower left-hand corner with a conscious or unconscious assumption that the world is still a predictable and plannable and stable place, and that most people is on the X side. If we disagree with this, then this is not the place to be. Then we need to move up in that upper right-hand corner by addressing both leadership horizontally and our management processes vertically. And this is what we need to get out of. Traditional management, rigid, detailed, annual, rules-based, all the micromanagement, centralized command and control, a lot of secrecy, and a strong belief in sticks and carrots as ways to drive performance. So what do we need to do then? A few headlines in both dimensions. On the leadership side, we need to be more purpose-based, more values-based, less rules-based. We are not saying that there shouldn't be any rules, but less of them and more purpose, more values. More autonomy, obviously. In this VUCA world, there isn't always time to run 9 floors up. And with these people on board, they can very often make wise decisions for themselves. Transparency, here comes that important word again. And in this context, it's actually good news for scared managers. And the good news is that transparency can actually be quite an effective control mechanism. Let me give you an example. The Swiss pharmaceutical company Roche, which is today on a beyond budgeting journey, did a very interesting experiment some years ago around travel costs. In a pilot, they kicked out the travel budget, kicked out travel rules and regulations, and replaced it with full transparency. So with a few exceptions, then everybody could see everything. If you travel, to where did you fly, sleep, eat, cheap or expensive, open for your colleagues to see, and vice versa. And guess what happened with travel cost in that pilot? Came down through a very simple self-regulating control mechanism, right? This was about tearing out pages in the rules book instead of doing the opposite. At the same time, transparency is very powerful. It has to be applied with wisdom. If it becomes naming and shaming, it doesn't work. That's why we should always position transparency more from a learning perspective than from a control perspective, right? How can we learn from each other if everything is secret? And last but not least, internal intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation. And I'm sure you are familiar with the research out there about what motivates people. And I can think of no area where there's a bigger gap between what most businesses are practicing through individual bonuses and what most research is telling us. It's simply amazing how few have heard about the power of mastery, autonomy, purpose, and belonging, and instead kind of fall back on what I call managerial laziness, dangling a bag of money in front of people's noses, do this and get that, right? Mastery, autonomy, purpose, belonging, it takes more leadership, right? So it's not necessarily easier, but so much more effective in helping people motivate themselves. Anyway, and by the way, the view we have on individual bonus or bonus and beyond budgeting is that we love in common bonus schemes. We are quite skeptical to individual bonuses. Anyway, a number of companies, many companies, they have the very best intentions when it comes to people and leadership. They say the right things, they write the right things, but it doesn't help with these theory Y leadership intentions and visions if there are theory X management processes, which is the case in so many companies. So if we are serious about these words and intentions, we need to make sure that they are reflected in our management processes, which very often means changing our management processes and also changing our management processes to become more VUCA robust. So a few headlines then about what that means in practice. Typically, the traditional detailed budget, it has to go because it represents so much of what we find in that lower left-hand corner. More specifically, when we should set targets and goals, maybe we could find some inspiration in soccer or football, as we call it here in Europe. I have yet to hear a soccer team saying that the ambition for next season is to score 29 goals and get 32 points. They don't think like that. Those are budget goals. And it doesn't make sense at all. They think in terms of doing well against peers, right? And so in relative terms, and that thinking can actually also be relevant in business in many cases. When it comes to the cadence and rhythm of all of this, we need to organize these processes where it makes sense, where it's possible, on rhythms that are more business-driven, more event-driven, and less calendar-driven. The fiscal year of January to December is very often a completely artificial construct from a pure business point of view. And last but not least, when we shall evaluate what good performance is about, that cannot be reduced to comparing two numbers, actual versus budget, and then conclude. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent performance language. And this, my friends, was a crash course, high-level crash course in Beyond Budgeting. It is about business agility. It is about addressing both leadership and management processes in a coherent, consistent way in order to become more adaptive and more human. Not necessarily as a goal in itself, but you know as well as I do that this is key, not just to survive and thrive, but to outperform in today's and tomorrow's people and business realities. It is as simple and as difficult as that. So this is the high-level version of Beyond Budgeting. This is the model itself. Again, both looking at leadership and management processes. And that tagline is important: performance the right way. Beyond Budgeting changes how we define performance and how we deliver performance. What is said about leadership principles here on the left-hand side is not necessarily that unique. Talking about purpose, values, transparency, autonomy as examples. Many other communities out there have the same focus, but many of them have not reflected very much about what kind of management processes are needed to activate these good leadership intentions. In Beyond Budgeting, we have thought about that. That is why there is this focus on creating coherence between the two, so that what we do on the right-hand side reflects our intentions on the left-hand side. So coherence is key. A classical example of the opposite. It doesn't help to, principle 4, talk loud and warm about autonomy and how much we trust people, if everything we do on resource allocation, or if we on resource allocation say that, well, okay, we trust you so much, but not that much. Of course, we need detailed travel budgets, right? Hypocrisy, poisonous gaps between what is said and what is done. These principles are principles. This is not a recipe. What this should mean in any organization depends on that organization's business, culture, history, and that's the way it should be, right? I don't like management recipes, and there are some of them, because in a management recipe, somebody have done all the thinking for you. The only thing you have to do is to buy the books, hire the consultants, take the boxes. I find that both a bit boring, but also a bit dangerous. Here you need to think for yourself. And even if I'm a big fan of Agile, I see tendencies of recipes appearing on the Agile side today, and actually for quite some time. Does this stuff work? That's a question we often get. Well, we have some pretty good indications, very good indications. First of all, very few companies go back once they've started. I don't need one hand to count the number of companies going back. That's a strong indication that this works and something that companies like, and managers like, employees like. But what has happened lately is that the big consulting firms, the really big ones, have become seriously interested in Beyond Budgeting. They have all reached out to us, almost all of them. There's one exception. I won't name who it is. They want to work with us in some form or shape because the clients are asking for it. We are not naive. We know that they have their agendas, and we come from different places, but we have actually decided to go for it. We would rather help these companies and their clients succeed than to stand on the outside, watch them fail, and give Beyond Budgeting a bad name. And what has happened here is that some of these firms have done surveys among clients and companies about how does Beyond Budgeting work. BCG did Boston Consulting Group, did a study among its clients, its Beyond Budgeting practitioners, and asked them, what kind of benefits are you seeing? And this is what they came up with. quite impressive numbers and very interesting areas. And it's quite interesting to see that the number one was actually a very direct positive hit on the revenue side of your company. Maybe because the sales target cannot actually be a ceiling on sales performance, right? Once you hit it, as one example. Many of the others are a little bit more indirect, but they do end up with a positive effect on the bottom line on a shorter and longer time horizon. Another consulting company, Bain and Company, had a slightly different angle. They have defined a group of companies which they call leading companies in financial planning. And they looked at to what extent are these companies applying the beyond budgeting principles compared to the rest of these companies that they don't regard as leading. And quite interesting numbers, leaders here in dark blue. And on each of those, you can see that the leaders are much more active in applying this way of leading and managing than what the non-leaders are. Of course, I mean, we should be a bit careful with kind of putting too much into service like this, but it does give some interesting indications. And also, this is what some executives need to hear. They don't get interested in beyond budgeting before they are told by these big firms that this is actually good stuff. And yeah, a number of companies are today on a beyond budgeting journey in some form or shape. And I could have talked for hours and hours and hours here about amazing management innovation taking place here. We don't have the time. One reflection, you won't find too many Silicon Valley companies here. You know this better than me, but my experience is that many of these very progressive companies when it comes to technology innovation are behind the curtain when it comes to how they are run, especially after they became listed, actually very conservative and not in any way leading when it comes to management innovation, which is quite sad because they are really losing out a big potential. I want to share with you a very short example. This is a bank, a Swedish bank. You find it at the top here in the middle, called Handelsbanken, 500 branches in Northern Europe, quite big in the UK. And this is the guy that got it all started many years ago. He has passed away now. And this is, by the way, what he said about the budget. This is a very interesting bank in many dimensions. First of all, because the bank has no budgets, no targets, no individual bonuses, they hardly make forecasts. Second, the bank has been performing better than the average of the competitors for a very long time, all the way back since 1972. They started out in 1970. So that's another interesting thing. They've been doing this for a very long time. And this is among the most, and the reason they perform so well, this is among the most cost-effective universal banks in Europe with the best customer satisfaction. They have amazing numbers on both. A lot of autonomy, a lot of transparency, a lot of league tables, or what we call league tables in Europe, a lot of kind of comparing branches on performance, but with a lot of autonomy for these branches to do what is right in order to climb, and in order to make sure that branches help each other. No individual bonus, just a bonus, common bonus scheme driven by how is the bank doing compared to other banks. Again, something that actually drives internal collaboration instead of blocking it. Amazing company. I've written a lot about this company in my books, so you should really check them out. I know that some people who see beyond budgeting the principles for the first time feel a bit overwhelmed. Maybe not you guys, but I assume there are not too many finance guys in the community here. I don't know, but some finance people and some others feel a bit overwhelmed. If that is the case, I've got some good news. There is a very simple place to get started that later can take you into these bigger discussions. And it has to do with asking a very simple question. Why do we budget? And when I said budget here, I'm talking about more than cost budgets, more than project budgets. I'm talking profit and loss budgets, cash flow budgets, balance sheet budgets, all of them. And the reason companies make budgets is actually more than one. There are three different reasons. Companies make budgets in order to set targets, financial targets, sales targets, revenue, production targets. At the same time, this budget shall be a kind of forecast of what can next year look like in terms of profits, cash flow. So forecasting is the second purpose. And the third purpose is resource allocation, handing out bags of money on operational costs and on investments. And it might seem very efficient to solve all three in one process and one set of numbers, but that is also the problem, right? Let me explain why. Let's assume that we are moving into a budget process, and upstairs, corporate finance, they want to understand next year's profit. And they start on the revenue side, asking responsible people, what's your best number for next year? But everybody knows that what I'm sending upstairs will come back to me as a sales target for next year, or a revenue target for next year, maybe with a bonus attached to it. And we all know what that insight can do to the level of numbers submitted, right? That will be this way, in order to make sure that you hit your numbers. Moving to the cost side, operational cost investments, the same people, other people are asked for the best numbers. But everybody knows that this is my only shot at getting access to resources for next year. And some might also remember that 20% cut from last year. And that insight and that memory might also do something to the level of numbers submitted. And we all know that this time the numbers go the other way. And I'm sure there's a lot of smiling in faces and nodding heads out there now, because this is something people recognize. And this is a problem, not just because it destroys the quality of numbers, but also because it stimulates this borderline unethical behaviors, even if I'm not blaming anyone beyond the system. The good news here is that there is a solution. We can, and in many cases should, do these three things, but in three separate processes, enabling this to be different numbers, because these are different things, right? A target is an aspiration, it's what we want to happen. A forecast is an expectation, it's what we think will happen, whether we like what we see or not. Brutally honest, the expected outcome. And resource allocation, that's about optimization of scarce resources. And because we have separated, now a target can, for instance, be more ambitious than a forecast, which it typically should be. But now we can start to improve each one in ways impossible when it was all bundled in one process, one set of numbers on the left-hand side. So now we can have great discussions about how can we set better targets that inspire and stretch people without feeling stretched. And thinking relative and peers here can sometimes be an effective key to that. How can we get the politics out of forecasting? Well, for instance, by making clear that the forecast here is just a forecast. It's not a bid into a target negotiation. It's not an application for resources. It's just a forecast. And we don't need a million details here. We are looking at the future. There's uncertainty. Very different from looking at the past doing accounting when the uncertainty is gone. And actually, some companies, having kind of spent many years improving these, takes the next step of saying, do we need targets? Do we need forecasts? And in some cases, the answer has been no, right? The last purpose is something we never can get rid of, resource allocation. That is something you always will have to do in some form or shape. And these are some headlines of some alternatives to what Mr. McKinsey could offer us 100 years ago. And last but not least, when we have separated, we can now organize each of these processes on a rhythm which better reflect not just the kind of business we're in, but also the kind of purpose we are looking at. Whereas target setting would be done much less often than forecasting, and of course resource allocation should take place almost continuously. So I see we've got 10 minutes left, and we've got two choices if we're going to stick to the time schedule and allow for questions. I could either stop here and then we have 10 minutes for questions, or I can take 4 more slides to explain how we manage cost without a budget, because that's where the questions are. Any preferences here? I'm flexible when it comes to both. Stacy, what are you saying?
I'm thinking push through 4 more slides.
Okay,
4 slides.
right. Very good. Okay. So here is a metaphor for the way we recommend people to think when it comes to managing cost. Imagine a company that requires fuel to produce and operate. What would be the best way for this organization to be supplied with fuel? Would that be to be given a fixed number of fuel cans once a year, January 1? Or would it be to have fuel access through a pipeline where you can consume more if you produce more? And that, my friends, that was a leading question, right? And this latter way is very much the dynamic resource allocation thinking in beyond budgeting. When it comes to tools, then we separate between what you call OPEX and CAPEX. So CAPEX investments is easier than operating costs. Let's start with CAPEX. At Equinor, that company do not have a traditional investment budget where you sit in the autumn the year before and decide everything, exactly how much to invest, exactly split on these projects, and then you hand out these bags of money as next year's project money for each project. Instead, there is a process inspired by our private finances. Imagine that you're planning an extension to your house, and it's April, you go to your bank and ask for a loan, and they tell you that, sorry, we are only open in October. And of course, no bank would think like that, right? But in business, that's the way it is, right? The bank is always open, is only open in the fall. At Equinor, the bank is always open. So the line can always forward the project for approval at any time. Yes or no depends on two things. How good is your project and can we afford it as things look today? So a much more continuous delivery of resources, making decisions at the right time and also at the right level, making sure that not all decisions are taken at the top. Not that difficult when it comes to investments, a bit more challenging when it comes to operating cost, but we do have a solution for that as well. But whatever solutions we have, it must build on what we call a cost-conscious mindset, which means asking different questions than what you typically see in a budget world. That's the question you have on the left. Do I have a budget for this, right? And if you don't have, well, then it's not okay, and vice versa. Instead, the question on the right are those we should ask. Is this really necessary? What's good enough? How much value is this creating? And is this within my execution framework? As I will come back to on my last and final slide, this is not an anarchy. We are making the room to move in bigger, but there are still wars in this room. And these are questions we should ask every time we spend money, every cent, every dollar, and not just in November and December when the budget bag is almost empty, right? So, operating costs. We have a menu of alternatives. What we want to leave is that detailed budget on the left-hand side. We want something with more autonomy, more flexibility. Here is one alternative. We call it the burn rate guiding. There's still a number, but in the range of 1,000, right? Or 1 million, 10 million, 100 million. Within that, full autonomy to do the right thing. Big difference between the two. And we call this a burn rate guiding because this is not a bag of money that you've been given. This is to help, it's giving you guidance on what kind of activity level is expected in financial terms until something else is decided. If we are uncertain whether the number should be 1,800 and 1,200, we can move from the absolute world to the relative world and start to think in unit cost instead, right? You can spend more if you produce more and vice versa. We can make it even more relative and compare unit cost versus peers, and your unit cost should be competitive, even more self-regulating. If you have internal profit centers which fully control their own income and cost side, if these units have a tough bottom line target, that's also a way of managing cost. These companies, these units cannot run away and spend money like drunken sailors, but it might be okay to spend more cost if what they spend is what we should call good cost. Good cost is not the problem, they create value. It's the bad cost we want to get rid of. And when the CFO of Equinor was asked, that's fine, but what's the difference between good cost and bad cost? His simple response was, you guys out there know even better than I do what is good cost and what's bad cost in this company. The last alternative here is nothing at all. No budget, no target. The only numbers we have here are actual cost numbers. And here we look at trends. We can use control charts, moving averages. And if a trend looks okay, we do nothing. If it looks a bit strange, we investigate. And very often there are very good reasons. But this is important. We might also come across managers, teams who consciously or unconsciously abuse the trust that lies in this model. The further to the right, the more trust you are showing. And the only thing you know if you show trust is that someone will abuse it. At Equinor, it has happened, it will happen again. That is not the issue. The issue is, how do we respond? The simple but wrong response is the clothing hanger response, to punish everybody because somebody did something wrong, right? This trust thing doesn't work, everybody back to the old way. The right response is to deal firmly with those involved and let it have the necessary consequences. This is not about being soft. It's about, again, not punishing everybody because somebody did something wrong. The further to the right we are, the more trust is shown, the stronger you have to be on values and direction. And finally, any of these mechanisms, which can also be combined, should be supplemented with 2 additional guardrails. One is decision authorities. How big a decision in financial terms can a manager make before he or she has to go one level up? Nothing to do with budgets. These authorities have to be generous enough, right, to make sure that not everything is ending up upstairs. And the last one is spending guidelines. Again, Equinor, in Europe, we fly coach. In outside of Europe, we can fly business. Nothing to do with travel budgets. It just helps people to make decisions. So that's what I wanted to share with you. These are my coordinates. If anybody wants to connect, Twitter, LinkedIn, this is the only thing I write about. There are no cats and dogs and grandchildren, I promise, just Beyond Budgeting. Beyond Budgeting website and also my own. And what you just heard is the very short version. The long version, which Stacy mentioned, is this book, which I wrote some years ago, which has more of everything, more cases, more about the original case for me back in mid-90s, Borealis, before there was anything called Beyond Budgeting. There was a chapter about Beyond Budgeting and Agile and more about implementation. And then a few weeks ago, this book came out, which is a shorter book on purpose, written for busy people with little time to read. So it has the key messages from earlier books, but also a lot of learning since the last book came out. And I'm extremely proud that Gary Hamel, that you might be familiar with, wrote the foreword. I'm proud to say that he's a good friend of mine, and he's a wonderful person and wrote a great foreword. So with that, I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to your questions. So sorry for kind of leaving not that time, but I'm flexible on time. I mean, so it's all up to you.
Thank you very much, Bjarte. That was awesome. So yes, let's take a few questions. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I wanted to upvote Lauren's question of how you tie this beyond budgeting, which I think we can all agree with, to the traditional finance models where they have balance sheets and quarterly reports to investors and all that sort of thing. How do you bring that transition into effect in these places? How do you get them to let go of that old mentality?
Well, I mean, I think we need to distinguish between accounting and doing your profit and loss and balance sheet on a quarterly basis and sharing results with the market and so on. That is Equinor is listed in New York. It's a listed company. The company still provides quarterly results. So this is about the company defines performance. It doesn't give earnings promises to the market. It just says that we will perform better than the average of competitors. But what I've been talking about is what we do looking forward and how we lead and manage to make sure that those numbers add up in a good way. And when it comes to the investor community, you often get that question, what about the investor? What about banks? Well, those are not the barriers. If you show them that separation, they will be more than happy. They will get more information than polluted budget numbers. So these external bodies are often used as excuses, right? But they are not the barriers. All the barriers are internally in companies, and they are sitting up here. This is about changing the way we think, which is much harder than changing the way what we do. There's no rocket science in what we do. The challenging thing and important thing is to change how we think.
Thanks.
Just like in the Agile world, it's all about mindset.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Other questions? Thank you, Jim. That was awesome.
Yeah, another one.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm seeing a parallel here between what we've learned to do in development with an agile mindset. We stop trying to look out too far in the future because planning too far where there's unknown creates waste. In the same way, trying to create a budget, a spending plan for too far out in the future creates waste. It's wasted effort. So can you transition organizations by saying, hey, let's get away from annual planning. Why don't we just cut it back to quarterly and just do it once a quarter. We'll do fewer things in it and we'll spend less time doing it. And lo and behold, things may change a little bit. We'll make a really rough look at what the year might look like, but we'll only do refined budgeting for the foreseeable quarter. Is that kind of a baby step to get them to start abandoning this?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I didn't talk about what a company is doing on forecasting, but that is something many companies do. They do something not just with the frequency, but also with the horizon, right? So they kind of adapt their forecasting horizon to what makes sense, right? And depending on what kind of business, that might be very short, or actually in some cases longer. So a kind of business-driven frequency and time horizon on forecasting is what we recommend. Absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
I have a question on like SEC filings, and I'm not sure in Europe if there are security and exchange filings that companies are required to do. But how do you manage that requirement for a public company with beyond budgeting?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, Equinor is a listed company, listed in New York, and it's not an issue. I mean, there are no requirements, even in the SEC, about kind of budget numbers and so on. And if there should be, give them a target in the forecast, and they have even better information than what they had before. So again, I mean, just trust me, there are no barriers in this area. People think there are, but if they really investigate it, they are non-existent or based on misunderstandings. But you will find finance people who will tell you that there are these barriers, but it's not true. We do have US companies who have gone down this route. So yeah. And you know, again, go ahead.
Excuse me, there must be some education you need to do with your kind of your investment analyst, when you do your investor calls, because they're going to revert to how things have always been done.
Yeah, and again, Equinor went through that back in 2005, so many years ago, with the analysts, and they get it. I mean, these are bright people. The issue is that they never realized that there was anything else than budgets to ask for. So when we explain this separation of budget purposes, that key slide I talked about, they get it and they like it. So again, the barriers are all internally and they all up here.
Right.
It's all mindset. Yeah, that's
yes.
so true. We see it everywhere for sure. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, just a quick question. How often have you run into organizational structure being an impediment to trying to implement this?
One of the beyond budgeting principles is actually about organization, and we are agnostics when it comes to structure. We think this can work in any structure, and we think there's an overemphasis on structure in Agile, and this focus on doing the Spotify model, as you all know, is meaningless. So if you look at the Equinor organization chart, it looks quite hierarchical, traditional. But that chart says nothing about the low power distance, nothing about all the collaboration across, and so on and so on. So I think too often we resort to shuffling the organizational boxes, and I think that will fix it. We don't think that's the case.
Okay.
Agreed. Thank you for that. One final question from the chat. Ivan actually put a question in. So in the Agile world, we find that that Agile transformation can happen from the top down as a decree or as a grassroots effort bottom up. Ivan's question is, do you need this to be a top down initiative, meaning the C-suite really needs to own and drive this, or is there any kind of a bottom-up grassroots implementation that you've seen?
Just one reflection on your question from a slightly different angle. And what I'm going to say now is not criticizing Agile. I'm a big fan. But I think that the main reason for Agile's initial success has to do with its birthplace in software development and how teams work.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happened in big organizations in early Agile days, what did executives observe? Better projects, better outcomes, more engaged employees. Who can be against that? Wonderful, guys. I love Agile. Keep up the good work. Then you start to scale Agile, and it has implications for executive beliefs and behaviors. And then it isn't that fun anymore, right? So I think that you can't scale Agile using exactly the same framework, language, ways of thinking. It has to be supplemented with something, and it can start as scaling up, but then it must be supplemented with beyond budgeting, because beyond budgeting fills the holes that you find in Agile when you scale it. But when it comes to beyond budgeting, we never talk about scaling beyond budgeting because it comes scaled, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is typically, very often, it is a broad kind of corporate initiative, but not cascaded. It's the best way to do it is kind of to have this translated and people take ownership to this. Sometimes it is pilots and so on, many ways of doing it, but again, there can be no true Agile transformation without beyond budgeting. No way.
I think all of our LPM folks in the room just said amen. Awesome. Well, thank you, Bjarte. It was a pleasure to have you come and talk with us today.